Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this composer feature concert that is part of the Whistling Hens Chamber Music America Residency Partnership Program. This is the result of a grant that we won from Chamber Music America, and we're so excited to be able to feature two composers tonight. And the first is Diana Rosenblum. You'll hear us perform her piece Winter Rain, and we've got her here to talk with us about it. Now, for most of our audience, we don't know that much about you already. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your compositional background. Maybe when did you realize you were interested in composing? What set you on that trajectory? And I mean, I know you have a personal family connection to that, but if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to your point as a music composer.
Sure. My becoming of a composer took a little bit of an unorthodox trajectory just because I didn't realize that I wanted to compose until well after I graduated from my undergraduate degree. I was kind of meandering. I had done my undergraduate studies in philosophy, and I had interest in linguistics and languages and done some foreign language study and also creative writing study. But I was a little bit of a wayward soul for a few years after graduating from college. And it was really just sort of a spontaneous thing that I began pouring out this solo piano repertoire at age 26, and it felt very fulfilling and very natural. I guess for a kind of more complete background, I did grow up in a very musical family, and so music was not foreign to me in any way. I started my piano studies at age 4 and cello at age 7. So up to that point in my life, I had identified as a musician, but only as a performer, only as a performer. So, you know, I had played in youth orchestras and my college orchestra as a cellist and chamber ensembles, and played in some chamber ensembles that were dedicated to new music during my undergraduate study. But I hadn't really contemplated a career in music, and it wasn't until my mid-20s that I discovered that I had an aptitude for it, and I entered into a master's degree, a master's degree in composition, I should say, a relative novice compared to many of my peers. And at that time, I felt I had a lot of catching up to do. The business of composing is not just creative, but there are some technical considerations when it comes to notation, using notation softwares, and preparing parts for players, and learning to interact with performing musicians from the position of being a composer as opposed to a fellow performer. So that took some acclimation in my late 20s. Now I should say I'm also in my mid-30s, and I feel that I finally settled into the role of a composer and let my performer capabilities kind of atrophy and fall into neglect. So now I feel I've really entered into kind of my own in that respect.
Yeah, well, and I'm a lot more familiar with your works as a performer myself, as an instrumental performer as opposed to a vocalist. And I'll let Jen talk in a minute about her thoughts on your technique as it comes to choosing text and writing for voice. But as far as your compositional process goes, what is that like for you? I mean, where do you normally start? Is it the melody, the harmony with the specific instrumentation? Your point earlier about music notation, our audience here has some knowledge of that now, because just about 2-3 weeks ago, I gave a presentation on music notation history and music notation software. So they have a little bit of background in that technical aspect of writing music. But what's that like for you, the whole creative process?
Sure. I think, again, perhaps my approach tends to be a little bit unusual. I have a particular interest in counterpoint. And so I don't necessarily start with either melody or harmony, but I'm interested in the ways in which melodic lines kind of combine with themselves in some kind of imitative form. So when I speak of counterpoint, I am referring to, Baroque forms like fugue, or even more distantly historical forms like canon, where a canon would mean that a single voice would be repeated in another voice, and they kind of overlay with one another. And so one of my areas of interest is finding ways in bringing these sort of ancient contrapuntal textures into a modern compositional idiom. So that's one area of interest that I have. And then I guess in general, instrumentation that you mentioned is very important, because that's sort of a defining feature of any given piece. And when you write for a particular instrument or a particular ensemble, ideally you're writing music that is idiomatic for those instruments, or for the voice. And by that, meaning that it falls comfortably in the vocalist's range, or it falls comfortably in the performer's hands. Even when you introduce aspects of virtuosity to a piece, you still want it to be within the range of comfort, and that you're not doing damage to an instrument or to a human being who's attempting to play your work. And but I guess even beyond that, beyond just the technical on an aesthetic level, I derive a lot of inspiration from considering the particulars of any given ensemble format. And so I mean, I guess to bring it home here to Whistling Hens with clarinet and soprano, I mean, it's such a unique combination and a beautiful combination. And one thing that strikes me about it is that both the voice and the clarinet are obviously instruments that rely on breath, and in order to produce sound, and are very singing instruments, and are both, I would say, fairly agile. But the range of the clarinet is really expansive, and I think very special to, because the clarinet really does dip into lower ranges, and it has a very expansive upper range. I mean, Natalie can speak to this more eloquently than I can. But in each of these, I guess my compositional impression, not as a clarinetist, is that each of these ranges of the clarinet has a very distinct sonic persona, and they happen to envelop the range of the soprano. And so those are some considerations that I've had in the back of my mind as I approach not just setting text, but setting text for these two instruments in that unique combination that comprise your particular ensemble.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned text, I was wondering, because when I look at your canon, I see majority instrumental works, but there are, of course, some vocal works as well. When you work with text, do you have a certain approach to it? Do you prefer poetry or prose? Do you have specific themes you prefer, or perhaps specific writers that you lean toward?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, I would say I tend to lean more toward poetry, and I think my struggle with text setting, if I might call it that, is that I had for a long time in high school and throughout college dabbled in poetry myself. So I sort of developed a separate relationship to poetry as an autonomous genre, separate from my relationship to music. And when I see a poem, it's a challenge because it places demands on where the composition might go. You have to respect and honor the structure of a given poem and let it lead the composition, as opposed to imposing some more abstract compositional idea on top of it. And those are not bad things, it's just particular to the case of text setting. So in my background in enjoying poetry kind of as its own field, I've been drawn to a lot of early 20th century modernists, Marianne Moore. I love Adrienne Rich and Mae Swenson, Wallace Stevens. These are sort of where I go. I guess all of the modern poets have, not to generalize, but typically, well, I guess this is a generalization, a very imagistic sensibility. So a way of presenting images with language that is very exact and very compact, and that appeals to me. For the purposes of setting text to song, I have perhaps gravitated toward poetry that presents natural imagery, as in the case of Winter Rain, the song that will be performed tonight. And so that was a piece that was written in the context of my study at the University of Oregon, where it rains for 90% of the year. And then we have a particularly verdant late spring, before it goes back to being a rainforest. And that is the subject matter of the poem. And so it kind of felt like a natural extension of the environment in which I was living at the time.
Well, I know we've mentioned it in passing, but I can tell you that Diana is currently writing a piece for us, and she's been working on the text for this. We've had some conversations about it. Diana, would you like to tell us any more about that? Give us a sneak peek into what you're working on, where you got it.
You know, I feel very lucky and privileged to have found the poetry of Mary Buchinger, who lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she is the president of the New England Poetry Club, which is a position that has been held by some very illustrious poets in the past. Clay Aiken comes to mind. And she's just a wonderful writer who speaks very candidly about particular details of her childhood, and actually quite a lot of her recent work confronts themes of grief. And while I haven't chosen to engage with that particularly heavy subject matter in my selection of text, which is still in progress, I'm trying to come up with texts that partner nicely with winter rain, and to that extent have nature themes. But I was very fortunate that when I reached out to Mary Buchinger, that she was not only amenable to having her words set, but she was very enthusiastic and let me know that clarinet was a favorite instrument of hers. So that
As
was,
it should be.
Yeah, a lucky coincidence. And one other thing, just on a purely pragmatic note, is that she owns the copyright to her own material.
Mm-hmm.
So in choosing to set more contemporary poetry, you know, that is often a consideration. If a poet is professionally published by a publishing company, they may have some ideas about the terms under which a composer may freely or not freely utilize that text. And some poetry firms may be more savvy than others. I've seen some term limits that are very severe, where, you know, a publication company might say, well, you can have the rights to the poem for 2 years. And that doesn't quite serve a piece of music that ideally will have a life beyond that time frame, and be an autonomous work of art on its own. So I was very lucky that not only I found a living poet for whose work I feel some affection and I've bonded with it, but who has welcomed this project and has granted me permissions to use her text, and that we don't have to negotiate further than that. So her name is Mary Buchinger, and I encourage all of you listeners to check out her poetry if you may be interested.
Well, if I can tell you anything about this community, it's that they are all very well read and will probably really enjoy diving into that.
Great.
So do you, as I mentioned, I noticed that majority of your works are instrumental works. Do you prefer to write for instruments, and do you think that's because of your background as an instrumentalist?
You know, that's another great question. I think this is probably the point at which I'm going to confess that I've perhaps avoided the realm of vocal writing or vocal scoring because I am the daughter of a composer who writes primarily for voice, Lori Laitman, who has established herself as really one of America's foremost songwriters and has written innumerable song cycles. I don't even want to miscalculate them, but they might be, you know, of the order of several hundred song cycles, and are performed widely internationally and within the United States by students and professionals. And so she is fairly well known for her text setting. And I grew up absorbing the content of her music and admiring it quite a bit. And I think as I've grown into a composer, we have a very fruitful and collegiate relationship as composers, kind of above and beyond, obviously, our relationship as mother and daughter. But I think to that extent, there may be something subconsciously that sort of steered me in a different way, because there are only so many apple doesn't fall far from the tree kinds of comments that you can field before it begins to feel infantilizing or invalidating. So, and then I guess as far as instrumental music goes, I do think I'm a little bit of an absolutist in how I think of pitch and rhythm. And so I work a lot with motive and developing motive and using particular intervals and particular gestures in a piece. And in the instrumental realm, that's unencumbered by the additional presence of text, which then also supplies meaning. And meaning implies mood and emotion and character. And so there are all these other additional extra musical considerations, textual considerations that come into play when you're working with a poem that in my mom's case are an enormous source of inspiration, that she derives all the sense of momentum for the composition of a piece from those very qualities. And for me, sometimes I can come to feel them to be a little bit of a conflict of interest, because I can no longer just freely manipulate the variables of a piece, but I have to be very sensitive to the demands of a text.
And I would like to just say, though, that as a singer, I of course know your mother's work, and I have sung it quite a bit, and it's because I had met her that we found you, and we found Winter Rain, because she recommended contacting you about your music when I met her.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, I love that idea of, in addition to the family connection, also being good colleagues. That's a lucky relationship to have, I think. One of the things that I always like to ask the composers who are virtually here at Collington, because they're obviously all living composers, is any thoughts you have or things you want to share with our audience who is primarily non-musicians or don't have a background training as a musician, what you think about how to interact with your music, or more broadly, just music by living composers, ways to maybe prepare the mindset to hear new music, or any advice that you have in that direction.
Sure. I think that there are so many different ways to listen to music and appreciate it. And every listener comes from a unique perceptual background. We'll say that we're all habituated to whatever music that we grew up listening to, or may or may not have encountered in a more academic setting. And so it's a position that I find myself in as a composer who has pursued a particularly academic path, now that I'm kind of very deep into a PhD degree in composition, where I've had to study music from a very technical point of view. And yet the art form of music is an expressive one, and one that communicates feeling, great amount of feeling. And I think that the domain of, the logical aspect and the technical aspect of music and the emotional and expressive aspect of music, ideally those two are fused and fully integrated. I think each composer has to reckon with what skills, kind of gaining the skills that best serve their expressive purposes, and communicate in the field of hearing the music, and may be heard differently by different people. That's a variable that we can't even really evaluate or calculate in any meaningful way. But as a composer, sort of, I try to straddle this divide, where even as some of my concerns may be esoteric or obsessive and technical, I'm still very concerned with communicating music as expression that can be felt. And so I don't think there's any right or wrong way to listen to a piece of music and to appreciate it. I think freshness and variety of different hearings are all equally valid, and I consider it my job as a composer to write music that satisfies both ends of that spectrum. Music that is well formed and well structured, and I consider it my primary task. And then because it's well structured, it can be received more easily, let's say. Oops, we might have lost.
We might have lost Natalie, but she'll be back.
Sure.
I'm going to turn off my video so that I don't get too blotchy.
Oh, sure. I think I about answered that question now.
Well, you are close to becoming Dr. Diana Rosenblum. and, at the Eastman School of Music there in Rochester. And of course, right now with coronavirus, things are quite uncertain. But what kind of projects or activities do you have coming up that you're excited about?
Sure. Well, some of the projects have had to be modified for that reason. As we're all aware by this point, gathering as audiences for concerts is now in jeopardy for an unknown, undetermined amount of time. And even coming together in large ensemble formats may not be recommendable for reasons of public health. I think even more so when it comes to wind instruments. And I've heard some concerns particular to singing in terms of the way in which the virus may be spread through aerosols. And I'm not a scientist or an epidemiologist, so I don't want to get too into detail. But it's a pure coincidence that I've spent a lot of the past year composing music for particular soloists. And that is a lucky coincidence, because when you're working with a soloist, you don't have to contend with factors of large-scale congregation, and working remotely becomes more possible. So in particular, and this is in keeping with my earlier remarks about counterpoint and being interested in counterpoint, I've been composing quite a bit for historical keyboard instruments. And by that I mean organ and harpsichord. My brother is a phenomenal harpsichordist, and so I've written him a suite of 4 pieces that are very colorful and somewhat literary in their conception. And as a composer, you get used to writing a piece and then awaiting a performance down the line. So there's this inevitable lag time between when I may have completed a piece and then allowing the performer time to fully embody that piece and learn it sufficiently. And so during this period of time, it's been one of my lifelines that I've finally gotten to hear my solo harpsichord works performed by my brother, and also my solo organ pieces performed by a dear friend of mine who is a fellow doctoral student here at Eastman, Chelsea Barton. And in the context of the organ work, that has relied on some very sophisticated software that creates a virtual organ out of recorded samples from real world organs that are positioned at cathedrals across the world, famous cathedrals like the Notre Dame Cathedral. And this team of microphone field recorders, set up their microphones and captured the attack of every single note on every single stop on all of these different organs. And I think there are even 3 different sound files that are generated when you play one single note. It's an attack, a sustain, and a decay when the note is released. So it's a very intensive, computationally intensive task for a computer to simulate a pipe organ. Pipe organs are massive instruments with pipes up to sometimes 32 feet long, but often the base range of organ pipes are 16 feet long. And these massive resplendent instruments are then packaged into computer software and can be triggered with the use of a MIDI keyboard. So that's been a recent project that, in lieu of being able to travel to Europe or travel to a cathedral or church space in the United States to record properly on a real organ, we have undertaken this virtual organ project, and that's been a source of enthusiasm and inspiration during this otherwise a little bit solitary and, sometimes depressing period of time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like you are absolutely staying busy. That's terrific. So now that we've all gotten to peer a little bit into your composer brain, I'm sure everybody's really excited to hear Winter Rain, which is what we're going to perform next. And then we're going to see you also in a little bit for our joint session with you and Ashi. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Diana, for your time and doing this personal interview with us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, and I am so looking forward to your performance tonight.
We hope you enjoyed Winter Rain by Diana Rosenblum. Next, we're going to hear from composer Ashi Day, who is local to the Washington, D.C. area. Thanks for joining us today, Ashi.
Thank you.
After we have this interview with Ashi, you will hear a piece that she wrote for us called The Green Child. So Ashi, the first thing we wanted to ask you about is your compositional process. Do you start with the melody or the harmony or the instrumentation? And can you explain how you start composing a new piece?
Sure. So I work mostly in the world of vocal music, and when I'm writing, I pretty much have never written anything that's just a musical idea. I'm always dealing with kind of adding music to or translating through music a non-musical idea. So I usually start with either the text or the concept kind of theme of whatever it is I'm trying to write for. So if I know the specific text, a lot of times I'll just start singing the words and see what comes. If it's a bigger piece like The Green Child, I'll think about the overall structure for a while and try to figure out how the different parts will go together, but then I won't really start writing until I have a concept of the text, because to me, I want the music to represent how I feel like the text would flow naturally out of a person.
Fun. So since you're talking about text, what's your approach to choosing text? Do you prefer prose or poetry, and why? And are there themes or specific writers that you prefer?
So a lot of times I will come across some sort of piece of writing and just kind of clock it in my head that this could be a good piece for something at some point. And that's how it actually worked for both Thursday and The Green Child with you. They were both pieces that pieces of writing I had come across before and felt this connection to, but I wasn't sure what to do with them until you guys proposed that I do something. And then I was like, oh yes, this would work really well for that instrumentation. I do like poetry more than prose, but it's more for me, I think singable text needs to be something that you can understand fairly easily on a first listening. So any kind of text that's really verbose, I don't think works really well. So poetry that has like tons and tons of descriptors doesn't attract me as much as it would attract some other folks. Any kind of like real technical writing, that feels unnatural to me. So I usually like to find simple ways to express thoughts. So with The Green Child and with the other piece I wrote that's more of an opera called For Whom the Dog Tolls, I worked on my own libretto, and I think part of that was just being like extra controlling, but part of it was I do have opinions about text and what flows and what feels natural and what's comprehensible, and so I wanted to have control over that, and I also wanted to have the freedom to write the words and the music at the same time. So instead of saying I need to set this exact text, I wanted to be able to say, well, here, combine the idea of the flow of the text idea and the flow of the musical ideas, so that what I did when I was creating the librettos for the parts that I wrote myself is I would do just a lot of drafting. I got a tip from a theater friend to do things called vomit drafts, where you just write a bunch of things and don't judge yourself. And after I did that a bunch of times, then it would start to kind of coalesce, but I didn't make final text choices until I was writing the actual music because I wanted them to really feel like they went together.
Interesting. Well, and I love, you're talking about For Whom the Dog Tolls. I think that was one of the first pieces I ever listened to on your website when I was learning about you. And I thought it was great and hilarious. And especially when I was exploring your music for the first time, because Jen knew you before we ever connected, is I was really struck by how everything seems to have a storytelling element. And maybe that has to do with the text that you gravitate towards. But I think you do such a great job of painting very, very vivid images in the listener's mind through a variety of techniques that you ask the performers to do, obviously through the text. I'm just wondering, are you consciously thinking about that storytelling element, or is that a core element of your writing? How do you see yourself in that way?
A lot of times I think of myself more like a theater artist than as necessarily a composer, because there's a lot of things composers do that I don't do. Like, I'm not writing symphonies and concertos and things like that. But I was a theater minor in college, not for any career purposes. I just loved it. I took improv for 5 years when I was teaching and loved that aspect of just responding in the moment and making stuff up. And I think there's a lot of potential for music to be theatrical, even if it's not a full-on opera, even if it's not anything like that. So I think even when I'm writing art songs and choral pieces, I'm thinking of it as like little scenes where you're trying to capture the mood of a moment or an insight into a character. So I've always thought of it that way. And in the last couple of years, I've started to write slightly bigger things that get into more expansive storytelling. But I love everything I do. I feel like it's just text painting. I'm just over the top text painting in a lot of pieces, because that's what I want to hear. I want to hear, I want to be able to hear something and connect the musical ideas to the text ideas on a first hearing. And then hopefully as I listen to it more, I'll get deeper layers. But I want it to be something that hearing it the first time, you can make a lot of connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that really comes through in the music, both with the pieces you've written for us, Thursday, and the Green Child, and the other things that you've done. So Jen already mentioned that you're local to the Washington, D.C. area. How long have you been here, or are you from the area?
No, I'm from right near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but I've moved here in 2012.
Okay, and I know you work at the Kennedy Center. Did you move here for that job?
I did.
Okay. So would you tell us a little bit about what you do there? I mean, we're getting to know you now as a composer, and that's how I know you, but if you'll tell us about your work at the Kennedy Center too.
Sure. I love the Kennedy Center. I've been there since 2012 in the education department, and my role has shifted a little bit, but basically my job is in music education and our education programs and productions team. And what we do is twofold. We will program a season of events every year that are educational events. So that's independent performances and concerts, but also talkbacks after performances after other performances and events related to what the opera is putting on and things like that. I work in music in general, but specifically also with the Washington National Opera, so I'm kind of in this hybrid role. The other aspect that we do is career development programs for high school students. So students who are interested already in going into opera or vocal performance or the arts or just exploring it, we work on figuring out ways for them to understand the worlds that they're looking into better and make better decisions for themselves, because it's a tough world to navigate and it's not common. And so that knowledge of what to do and what choices to make for college and beyond aren't always out there. So my goal is to try to level the playing field for that a little bit by making sure the opportunities to learn are there before students are too far down the path.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And, there are so many people here at Collington too, who are really active in the community and, do volunteer teaching and anything that helps, K through 12 education or the arts. They're very involved here. So it's great to hear that. I'm wondering, I know everything's kind of crazy right now with COVID, but do you have any projects that are coming up that you're excited about, maybe on the compositional front or center, What's on your horizon?
Well, at the Kennedy Center, we're taking our normal 3-week summer intensive for high school singers, and we're putting that online. So that's been a fun project. Personally, there's 2 things that I'm working on. One is I'm slowly putting together this collection of choral pieces that are based on Shakespeare texts, but without any context to the original plays, and with hopefully some real funny and weird ways to use a choir. The text that I'm working on right now is just a single line from Midsummer Night's Dream, where Helena says, "And I shall make a heaven out of hell." And the idea is just to take the words "make a heaven" and create a setting for that for chorus that could be done via Zoom, so it doesn't have to have audio syncing. And it's inspired by my dog, who inspires most of my stuff now, because everything is terrible, and yet we're sitting outside with him and he's as happy as can be, and just looking at him being happy helps me find a little bit of like happiness in the time. And then the other piece that I'm working on that's much slower because it just takes a lot of work is I'm writing a short opera for a countertenor friend of mine, and I'm hoping to make him a witch hunter a la the Renaissance era witch hunts in England and before, and have him do a piece where he gets to be a villain, and make it a little creepy and tie in some modern themes, but with this kind of distance of having it play off historical themes, so that there's this abstract element and then touch points, then everything that was happening then, there's a lot of echoes for what's happening now.
Oh,
I love it.
So
That's
Ashi,
great.
we premiered The Green Child back in March. The very last thing that we were allowed to do before COVID closures hit us was the Music by Women Festival in Mississippi. And because of time constraints for our presentation, we performed a shortened version for that premiere. So for the Collingtonians today, we will actually be performing the piece in its entirety for the first time. So is there anything you'd like, yeah, and it's awesome. So is there anything that you'd like to tell our audience about The Green Child before they hear the first full performance?
Sure. So this is a piece that is based off of 2 sources. There is a legend called the Green Children of Woolpit that may or may not be true. It's from medieval England, and there's historical accounts, but the historical accounts themselves say we're not sure if this is true or just like a story that's being passed around, where these 2 green children mysteriously showed up outside a small town in England, and they didn't speak the language, and they would only eat peas, and they brought them into their society. I came across it through a fairy tale kind of version of that story set by Marcel Schwab, who is a French writer, in this wonderful book called Fairy Tales of the Disillusion, which is translations of all these French fairy tales. And in that, he just uses one child and tells the story of her being found in the woods and brought into a village family and never quite fitting in. She didn't speak the language. She wouldn't take communion. She wouldn't eat the food. She was afraid of the fire. But the little girl was like, no, we have to protect this person that doesn't have anything else. Then the girl that brought her in was going to be sent to domestic service, which that is a fascinating topic to start looking into, is the history of domestic service in Europe, and what it meant to actually have to do that and how many people were in domestic service. And that terrified her. And so at the end of the story, I remember reading it for the first time and being so struck by the last line, which is about the green child leading her out into this unknown freedom. And so the idea of, especially being a woman at that time and making the choice to do who knows what in the woods rather than follow this path was really, really fascinating to me. And I loved the idea of the 2 children saving each other. And I loved thinking of it in a sort of psychological way, where you have that drive in yourself that's wild, and you have that drive in yourself that needs people and safety, and that there's this constant negotiation between yourself about what to do with that. And I think that's true for everyone. I think there's specific resonances for women who are pushed into certain roles in certain ways. And just the idea of these two characters help negotiating those differences, but doing it with love, I think is a really just fascinating way to think about it.
Ashi, that is beautiful. Really beautiful. I think everybody will hear that in our performance. So I'll just remind everybody that you can find the text for this story in your Whistling Hens Residency Program booklet. So don't worry if you can't understand everything, because there's a lot of words. You can read along in that booklet. And I just want to thank Ashi for doing this personal interview with us. We're going to see her in about 15 minutes when we finish playing her piece. She's going to come back and we're doing a joint interview with Ashi and Diana, who you heard from at the top of the program. And we're going to get to see what their process is like as it relates to working with a group like Whistling Hens and writing for soprano and clarinet. So thank you, Ashi, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Once upon a time, while wandering through the deep forest outside of her village, a little girl heard a strange noise. When she got closer, she saw another girl about her age, but her skin, hair, and eyes were as green and vibrant as the woods around her. The green child did not speak. But she cried, and cried, and cried. After a moment, the village girl approached her, slowly put her arm around her, and tried to comfort her with an old lullaby. When the village girl's father came, he was frightened, for he had heard rumors of she-devils in these woods. He did not like to see the little green girl crying, but he said she-devils were best kept far from the village. But the green girl cried out when he tried to take his daughter away, and the village girl refused to leave without her. Daddy, Daddy, we can't leave her here, a child in the woods alone. And we can't leave a child alone. We are so tired that we don't have room. What will become of her? And what could she be with shelter and safety and love? Now, the father liked to follow the usual ways, for he felt the usual ways had served him well. But still, he was not unkind, and he relented. And so it was that the village girl led a green child out of the wilderness and into the shelter and safety of her home. As usually happens, the girls began to grow up, and they did this always together. The green girl began to understand the language of the village, though she only ever spoke her own tongue. The village girl learned to listen and understand much as well. The village girl shielded her friend from the constant rumors of she-devil that followed her, though the green girl never seemed to mind them. And the village girl carried no fear of loneliness or teasing, for she knew she had a true friend always. When the two were finished with their chores, they would run rampant and play. This is the house that Jack built. This is the cheese that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the rat that ate the cheese that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the cat that chased the rat that ate the cheese that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the dog that worried the cat that chased the rat that ate the cheese that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the cow and the crow that horn that kicked the dog that worried the cat that chased the rat that ate the cheese that lay in the house that Jack built. This is the maiden all forlorn that milked the cow with the crumpled horn that kicked the dog that worried the cat dreaming of all they might do and all they could become. How many miles to Babylon? 60 miles and 10. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, and back again. If your horse be swift and your spurs be light, if your heels are nimble and your toes are light, you may get there by candlelight. You may get there by candlelight. The village girl's parents were not unkind, but still, they liked to follow the usual ways, for they felt the usual ways had served them well. They were of modest means, and they had a growing daughter who they wished to always have food and shelter, and as much respect as a girl from modest means might be able to claim. And besides, she was a hard worker. So, they decided they would send her away into domestic service, that army of invisible hands that held the mansions and castles of their country together. The village girl understood, and yet she cried, and cried, and cried. What will become of me? Will I live as a shadow, a bump in another's life, subject to someone who thinks that's what I'm for, that this is success for me, subject to someone who, are we so tight that we don't have room? The green girl watched her friend grow more and more distraught as the day approached for her to leave. On her last night at home, long after her parents had gone to bed, the village girl lay awake, shaking with tears. The green girl slowly put her arm around her friend. Then she walked to the door, opened it, and looked out into the vast night sky. Then she looked back at her friend and gestured to the deep, wild woods. And so it was that a green child led a young maiden away from the village and toward an unknown freedom.
We hope you enjoyed The Green Child by Ashi Day. And we're so delighted now to present both composers to you, Diana and Ashi. And we know that they've never met before until now, and we're delighted to have both of you with us. I'd like to begin by saying that Ashi has now written 2 pieces for us, both The Green Child and Thursday, but before that, she didn't have any repertoire for soprano and clarinet duo. Diana wrote Winter Rain in 2013 and is currently writing a piece for Whistling Hens that we've commissioned this year. We thought it would be interesting for our audience to hear from you about what it's like writing for our unique duo.
Yeah, so my question for you is, what do you think about writing for this very specific and somewhat niche instrumentation? Are you comfortable with it, or how's that evolved for you?
Ashi, do you want to take this one?
Sure. You know, it was a great thing for me. I normally write for the voice very exclusively, and so it was great to be able to work with you and have you talk me through kind of the things that you wanted to do and the things that would work for you. I really am, I like the combination of those two sounds, because I like how, in my experience, the different registers of the clarinet kind of mirror the different registers of the voice. Like my voice has always been like deeper and like kind of mellowish in the lower range, and then I have a terrible break, and then I get have a harder time with being bright but trying not to be too pinchy in the higher parts. So there's this kind of similarity there that you can exploit, and I found that really interesting, which is why I was excited to write a piece for you as two characters.
Yeah, we sort of touched a little bit in my personal interview on also the nature of the instrumentation and the unique challenges that it presents. And something came up actually in our casual conversation after we finished recording, in which Natalie and Jennifer were commenting on how the instrumentation sort of requires both musicians to be constantly active, and that because there are not, it's not an ensemble where, some other instrumentalist might carry the tune, so to speak, for a portion of time and give either a rest. One thing I've been very aware of is also, as the two voices are interweaving, that, they need to coordinate their pitch material somehow. I guess it's one thing we've never spoken about, whether Jennifer happens to have perfect pitch as a soprano. And I wouldn't approach any given piece kind of assuming that a soprano will pick pitches out of thin air. And so, it's something where the piece structurally should build cues into the substance of the music, and where the pitches that Natalie has in the clarinet are going to provide context for the soprano's entrance. And these kinds of considerations, maybe there's less flexibility than you might have with a piano, where you can build a fully fledged harmony and create context in that sort of way. But that being said, I agree with Ashi. I think it's a really beautiful combination, particularly because of their areas of overlap registrally and to some extent timbrally as well. So I've enjoyed it. Actually, Ashi, I wanted to say I was really struck by the use of characterization in your piece, Green Child, and some of the alternation between narration and singing. I thought that was a really striking way to bring more versatility out of the performers.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we definitely had a lot of fun trying to figure out, especially for me as the soprano, when I'm narrating, how much I'm giving and how much Natalie needs to pull back, because the projection, if I'm not careful, I'll push through there, and I'm more want to try to almost yell when I'm talking versus when I'm singing. But it was a lot of fun to have to play with speaking and singing and going back and forth. And Diana, to your point, I do not have perfect pitch. I do have relatively good pitch, but it definitely helps me when I sing pieces where I can have an easy way to find my next pitch. That's very helpful, but I have good enough relative pitch that I can find it eventually. So ladies, when you're writing for a specific group, do you find that your compositional approach is different when you have specific players in mind versus when you're writing without a specific group?
You first.
Sure. Yeah, in this case, we met virtually in the first place. I met Natalie and Jennifer through email correspondence, and now through video conferencing. So it's kind of this middle ground between, performers that I've known, on a personal level and performers that have approached me in a professional capacity. One thing I'll say is that it's always a blessing as a composer to have such gifted and talented performers whom you can entrust the music to, and that even not having met personally in prior occasion, there's a lot that can convey just through my absorption of your recorded materials and on your website and YouTube pages, just sonically, I was able to kind of instantly grasp the substance of your ensemble and how well you work together. So it's a pleasure. It's just purely a pleasure to write for great musicians.
Oh, thanks. That's why we brought you in here for this interview. But well, Ashi, I'm curious to hear what are your thoughts on that, writing for people specifically as opposed to starting with a blanket instrumentation?
Yeah, it's really nice to write for specific people because, there's the guidelines for the voice part or for the instrument, but there's always something different that a person can do. So I love that, Jennifer, that you were willing to go into a lower range than a lot of sopranos will go into. That is really great for creating that kind of lullaby sound. So if I were writing for just any soprano and clarinet, I wouldn't have done that. And then the same thing with Natalie, I could write you all these crazy high things. And then also because I'd seen what you had done with the impression in Thursday, I knew that I could something improvisatory and that you would or anything like that, which you do from performers. So it was really nice to have had that experience of seeing you perform and having you work with a smaller piece, to know what I could do and what I could play with for a bigger piece.
Yeah. Well, and related to writing pieces for specific ensembles, I would imagine that most Collingtonians have never commissioned a piece of music, and there's so much that goes into that. Even just on the administrative and business side, logistical things, even more broadly than Whistling Hens. I want to hear, what is the commissioning process like for the two of you? It could be things like agreeing on rates, how you apply for funding, how do you negotiate deadlines, how do you do contracts? There's so many elements to this other than just saying, hey, would you write a piece for me? Much beyond that. Maybe Ashi, if you could speak to that first, just because we finished 2 commissions with you, and then Diana, we're currently in the process. Any thoughts you have on that, or how you work with other groups, or how they're alike or different?
Sure. To be honest, I'm still newish to commissioning myself. I have my career trajectory is such that I spent about 5 years teaching after school where I wasn't writing as much, and so then I've built up the composition practice more since that time. So I'm really getting into commissioning more and more, and I think just the most important thing is to understand what you get out of a practice to make it worthwhile, worth all your time and effort. I'm balancing and things like that, so I want to make sure that I'm going to take on something that's going to make somebody else really happy, but I'm also going to get something where I'm going to write something I'm happy with, and then I'll also be able to share it. I'll have a good recording, or I'll have a learning experience or something from that. So in terms of rates and things like that, I can be pretty flexible, but I know that I need to, there's multiple things that I'm personally weighing. I'm personally weighing the time, how exciting I am about the piece, if I'll grow as a composer by doing it, if I'll have a piece that I can take other places and put into competitions or share, or have a good recording that shows my unique style. So those are the things that I'm balancing when I'm thinking about a new piece.
Yeah, that was so well stated. I find myself in agreement with a lot of what you just said. I also don't have extensive experience accepting commissions or kind of proposing commissions to ensembles. I'm sort of at the phase of my compositional career of, finding performers that I have a synergy with, and then forging some kind of mutually advantageous scenario that may involve other commodities than financial commodities. So, a recording opportunity in a concert hall where we're both going to end up with a product that serves us in a promotional capacity, even if there's no exchange of funds. in this scenario with Whistling Hens, I've been so lucky that you both are so proactive in seeking funding opportunities, and you have been awarded grants. And so it kind of, it was just such a nicely packaged opportunity kind of all around that there wasn't much need for negotiation, so to speak. It was just a kind of no-brainer to say yes and to run with the project. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that I guess as a composer, there's value as well to finding performers, even just on a peer-to-peer level, who are willing to incorporate your music into their body of repertoire and maybe bring it on tour or perform it multiple times, and that has value, intrinsic value unto itself. So when I find myself in that kind of circumstance where neither party can really offer the other anything in the way of a monetary exchange, but we both find a mutual affinity with each other's musicianship, I'm certainly happy to write music essentially for friends who are performers. And that's about where I'm at. We'll see as hopefully as my career expands and grows over the next decade, maybe, and things aren't on such personal footing, I'll probably have to look more toward these kind of commissioning guides that have I guess on American Composers Forum, for example, or New Music USA, that have some guidelines in terms of, the scale and breadth of a piece and how that should translate into a rate, commissioning rate. But at this stage, I'm just happy when I find musicians who are happy to play my music.
Yeah, well, you and Ashi are both so modest. I mean, you are both so deserving, in my view, of commissions. And also, I mean, we're talking about bartering, which is very generous and modest of you, but we firmly believe that living artists deserve to be paid for the work that they're doing. And I'm sure all of you who have read your program booklet by now, on the second page, you've got the Whistling Hens bio, but I'll just reiterate that a huge part of our mission is commissioning new music, partially just to have repertoire for us, because there's not a lot for clarinet and soprano, but so that we're also supporting women who are working in the arts. This is historically an area, especially for instrumental music, an area where women haven't had access to the same funding and educational and promotional opportunities. So it's really important for us to be able to provide that. Really, the only music women were writing in a way that was somewhat socially acceptable was stuff for voice or maybe music for piano. So we're really happy to be able to do it, and also to find composers that whose music we love so much. And I mean, I don't mean this in like a condescending way, but people who are younger in their compositional journey, so that we can be part of that, and also hopefully hopefully with what we're doing, help promote you and get you to where you want to go next. So I just wanted to tell everybody a little bit about that. And I hope this gave all of you watching at home a peek into what it's like working with living composers, getting to go through the creative process with them, getting to really collaborate in so many ways other than just, would you write a piece of music for us? Here's the instrumentation. Getting to know them as individuals. And I hope that personal connection speaks to you as much as it speaks to us. So please tune in to our last event of the residency. But for now, I'll just say goodbye and good night to Ashi and Diana. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a real treat to have you here and to have this dialogue and get that perspective.
Sure. Thanks for having me.